Does handwriting still have a place in modern Chinese learning? Let's explore 8 popular arguments in favor of writing Chinese characters by hand, each critically examined to see which ones truly stand up to scrutiny. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about reasons to write Chinese characters by hand. It's become increasingly common to argue against spending too much time on handwriting, but there are many counter-arguments or arguments in favor of writing Chinese characters by hand. Thus, in this episode and in a follow-up episode I will record later, I will present arguments in favor of writing Chinese characters by hand, and I will discuss each of them in turn to see if the arguments themselves are valid and how relevant they are for you as a learner of Chinese. Before we dive into specific arguments, I have a few things in general I think we should discuss first. So we have basically a spectrum here from people who claim that it's useless to learn to write by hand, it is not necessary in a modern digital society to write by hand, and so you can just skip it and save an awful lot of time that you can then invest doing something else, perhaps more reading, more writing, or more speaking and listening. Then on the other side of the spectrum, we have traditionalists who say that if you're not learning to write Chinese characters by hand, you're not learning Chinese or you're missing an important component. So characters and handwriting characters is essential. I don't think that either of these standpoints are stupid or uninformed or incorrect, but which one applies to you depends a lot on which assumptions you have about learning Chinese and what goals you have for learning the language. So essentially what I'm saying is that the answer depends on your learning situation and what your goal is. So let's take modern language learning curricula in the West as an example. These are typically fairly communicative, meaning that they describe how students are supposed to learn how to communicate, how to use the language to convey information, to receive information, exchange ideas, and the like. If this is the primary or maybe the only goal of learning a language, it should be clear that focusing a lot on handwriting is not very good. After all, you will almost never be required to write by hand in a modern digital society, and when you are required to write by hand, you will have access to a dictionary, because unlike in school, using a dictionary is not cheating in real life. As mentioned earlier, by skipping or at least cutting down on handwriting, you can save a lot of time that you can then use to get better at communicating through, say, reading and typing instead of reading and writing by hand. This is an argument that I fleshed out much more in an article and podcast episode called Chinese Character Learning for All Students, and it's episode 199 if you want to tune in. So the takeaway here is that if your main goal is to communicate, spending too much time on handwriting is not a good idea. However, communicative ability might not be the only reason people learn Chinese, and it's not the only possible goal. And this is what I meant earlier when I said that your goals and learning situation will influence what you think about handwriting and what is a sensible approach for you. If we focus solely on practical communication, what about things like cultural aspects? What about institutional learning, where you might have to learn to write by hand? What about teaching Chinese? Don't you need handwriting then? Or what about something more subjective, such as the feeling of inadequacy when you can't even write a simple note to your friend in Chinese by hand? Or what about the joy and relaxation that can come from writing beautiful characters? Like I said, if we have communication as the primary goal, I think it's hard to argue from an efficiency point of view that learning to write by hand everything you can say and type, for example, is a good idea. But as we have seen here, there might be other aspects that we need to take into account as well. So what I've done here over a few years is to collect arguments in favor of writing by hand. I've sorted these arguments into 4 sections, and in this episode then we will look at sections 1 and 2, and in a follow-up episode later we will talk about sections 3 and 4. So the sections are: number 1, practical considerations and functional use cases. Section 2, arguments grounded in learning efficiency and memory. Section 3, cultural and personal arguments. And section 4, handwriting as a cognitive tool and emotional experience. So let's start by diving into section 1, which contains the following 5 arguments. Writing by hand is sometimes necessary in real life, so you should learn it. Handwriting is necessary to progress through formal education. Handwriting is sometimes necessary in professional contexts. If you can't write by hand, you can't talk about Chinese characters well. Writing yourself makes it easier to read other people's handwriting. For each of these arguments, I want to discuss if the argument itself is valid, like does it make sense, and I also want to explore if handwriting is actually the key, because as we shall see, sometimes people conflate different things and call them benefits of handwriting, whereas the benefit might actually be due to something else. So let's get started with the first one then, which is writing by hand is sometimes necessary in real life, so you should learn it. This is an argument we've already talked about actually, so I won't say too much about it here. But in a society with smartphones, computers, and AI, we don't really need to write by hand. I've studied Chinese for almost 20 years, whereof 5 were in immersion environments, and the number of times I've been asked to write something by hand without access to a dictionary in real life is 0. This is not unique. I have talked to many people who live and work in China, and generally speaking, you don't need to write things by hand very often, and when you do need to write something by hand, you can use a dictionary if you forget how to write something. Naturally, this will be a bit clunky and slow, but it's still possible. As I also said earlier, real life is not an exam in school, so using a dictionary is not cheating. Unless, of course, it is, which brings us to the second argument. Handwriting is necessary to progress through formal education. This is unfortunately true, although it does depend somewhat on where you're studying. The fact remains, however, that most formal courses require you to write characters by hand. Sometimes they require you to write everything by hand, i.e. typing is not allowed as a substitute for writing by hand, and sometimes it's a subset of characters, but writing by hand is generally speaking still required. I say that this is unfortunately true because it's not really a good argument. I mean, learning something so that you can pass a course, if that skill is then not needed when you leave the course, is a bit backwards in my opinion. Still, if you want the credits, the diploma, the degree, etc., you might have to learn to write by hand. For example, when I was in grad school, which was entirely in Chinese, we had 3-hour in-class exams where we were supposed to write about teaching pedagogy, for example, and this requires you to be able to write by hand fairly well. Has anybody asked me to write about these things by hand in Chinese since then? Nope, not a single time. This is a decent segue to the next argument, which is handwriting is sometimes necessary in professional contexts. I'm a Chinese teacher, so I think it's nice to be able to write by hand, and indeed, if you are a Chinese teacher, I think having decent handwriting is good, although perhaps not required, strictly speaking. I've talked with dozens of students over the years who live and work in China, and I always make sure to ask them about handwriting. Most of them say that reading and typing is enough for the work that they do, but there are some rare exceptions where you actually need to write by hand. Or at least where it's highly inconvenient to not be able to write by hand. Still, to me it seems a little bit odd to spend hundreds or even thousands of extra hours learning to write everything by hand, just on the off chance that one day in the far future you will land a job where this comes in very handy. It would seem to make much more sense to take it easy with handwriting until you're closer to that job, and then you can invest the necessary effort to learn to write by hand. For the next argument, we're switching gears a little bit. This is no longer about practically being useful in, say, your job or because you need to write things in real life. It's more about related skills that become very hard if you don't know how to write by hand. So the next argument is, if you can't write by hand, you can't talk about Chinese characters well. This might seem like a strange argument, but the fact is that Chinese people do talk about writing characters quite a lot. For example, when somebody else introduces themselves to you or when you introduce yourself to them, you might need to explain the characters in your name so people know which they are and how to write it or type it later. So the argument is then that if you don't know how to write by hand, you can't really talk about Chinese characters. I think this argument is very weak. It's perfectly possible to be able to talk about characters without knowing how to write them by hand. And when native speakers talk about characters in Chinese, they very rarely do so using individual strokes. In other words, when you describe characters in spoken Mandarin, you normally don't just list the strokes as a dictionary might, or maybe your teacher did that when you were a beginner. That's not how normal people talk about characters. Instead, they indicate which character they mean by putting it in context, for example by including it in a word where it's not ambiguous, where it can only be one specific character. If it's a very rare character, they usually break the compound down into components and make sure to put those in context so the listener can know which character they mean. To do this, you need detailed knowledge about characters, but that's something you can get by reading and typing as well. If you're curious how Chinese people do talk about characters, I have an article specifically about that called How to Talk About Chinese Characters in Chinese, and I'll put a link in the show notes. Now we've reached the fifth and final argument in this section, which is writing yourself makes it easier to read other people's handwriting. So while you can choose to strategically cut down or ignore handwriting, you can't make this decision for other people. As I said earlier, you will rarely be required to write by hand in real life, but other people still write, so you need to be able to read their handwriting. And the argument here is then that if you can't write by hand, it's exceedingly difficult to read other people's handwriting, because you're not familiar with the principles that they use, you don't know stroke order necessarily, and you don't know the common ways of making shortcuts and the like. The difficulty of reading handwriting depends of course on who wrote it and how they write. So this ranges from the relatively simple, for example your teacher writing on the whiteboard, that's almost like reading printed text, to reading a doctor's notes, which seems like a different language. Naturally, most handwriting falls somewhere in between, so with some practice you can learn to read it, but it's not a given. Just because you've read a lot of printed Chinese or clearly written Chinese, you won't automatically be able to read normal people's handwriting. So let's look at a concrete example, and we're going to look at the character call, meaning mouth or entrance. The character itself is rather common, and it's also very common as a component. The correct way of writing this character is in 3 strokes. You go down, a vertical stroke, you lift your pen, go back up, then go right and down, a hook, and then you close the square at the bottom from left to right. This is not how people who don't write Chinese write a square, so if you ask a random English speaker to write a square, they will not write it in this order. And a fun fact, you can actually use this as a kind of test to see if somebody can write Chinese characters. If you ask them to write a checkbox or just a square, if they use this stroke order or anything resembling the Chinese character, you know almost for sure that they can write Chinese characters, whereas if they write it in 1 stroke or something like that, they almost certainly can't. The point here is that when you write this character quickly, assuming that you know the stroke order, you will not end up with, say, a circle, which is what somebody who wrote a normal square quickly would do. Instead, you'll end up with something resembling the numeral 12, so a 1 followed by a 2, and they are joined together at the base. This is a little bit hard to describe on the podcast, but if you go to the written article on Hacking Chinese, there is an image where I show this in actual handwriting. Now, the point is that things like this will be very hard to interpret when you read other people's handwriting if you have no idea about stroke order and can't write these characters yourself. I don't think this means that it will be impossible to read other people's handwriting, because using all the time you saved by not learning to write everything by hand, you can of course study other people's handwriting directly. For example, by reading things people have written by hand instead of sticking to printed text only. You can also use handwriting fonts to change any text into something that resembles normal handwriting, and this is something I discussed in episode 65, where we looked at learning how to read other people's handwriting specifically, so tune into that if you want to learn more. So in summary, I think this is a valid argument. It's not an argument for learning to handwrite everything you can type and say, but it is a good argument for learning to write a base set of characters so you understand things like stroke order and character composition. So let's conclude section 1 by saying that if you can decide entirely on your own and you are the only person you would take into account, then you can skip or at least cut down on handwriting quite a lot. But as soon as other people start having opinions, and especially institutions then, you might have to write by hand. And as we have seen, there are also concrete arguments for why handwriting can be quite useful in some cases. But it's rarely a call for writing everything by hand or being able to write all the words you know by hand, but rather having a basic familiarity with how handwriting works. So let's move on to section 2, arguments grounded in learning efficiency and memory. The arguments in this category are: writing by hand helps me remember characters longer and in more detail. The tactility of handwriting helps me remember the characters. Writing by hand makes it easier to distinguish similar characters when reading. So let's start with argument 1, which is writing by hand helps me remember characters longer and in more detail. I think it's hard to argue that this is wrong. For many students, writing by hand does indeed make them spend more time with the characters, processing them more deeply, and thereby also remembering them longer. This is also one of the most common arguments I hear in favor of handwriting, and it would then seem like a good one, except the fact that I think it conflates two things that should be kept separate. So while it's true that you can process characters more deeply when writing by hand, this is not a given. There are ways of practicing handwriting, such as copying stroke by stroke or copying in general, which doesn't require any deep processing at all. It's also possible to process characters quite deeply without doing handwriting. You can just study the details or look things up and study the composition of the characters and so on. This does not in itself require you to write them by hand. It's also a bit obvious that if you spend a lot more time, you will then also remember it longer, assuming that you're practicing in a valid and reasonable way. And this is not surprising. But remember, the whole argument here is that if you cut down on handwriting, you save a lot of time that you could then use for something else, such as studying characters. I don't think it's feasible to investigate this empirically, but I'd bet that directly studying characters is more efficient than simply writing them by hand. In other words, you're better off writing less characters by hand and taking some of that time that you save and invest that into studying characters properly. Say, looking up the structure, the functional components, maybe how the writing system works, and things like that. That's going to give you more information about the characters, and you will also understand the writing system and stand a better chance of remembering the characters long term. Next up, we have the tactility of handwriting helps me remember characters. Writing and typing feel very different, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that they are not the same thing cognitively either. Many students report that the muscle memory involved in handwriting helps them recall the characters later. This is something I've experienced myself. I mentioned earlier that I wrote quite a lot by hand in grad school, and sometimes just not thinking and just letting the hand write actually worked because I'd written so much by hand that if I stopped to think about what I was doing, that could sometimes actually hinder me rather than help me. So I think this argument has some merit, not because of learning styles or anything like that, which don't have much empirical evidence anyway, but because mixing different modalities and using different modes of practice is helpful for most people. Using different methods or tools for producing characters can definitely make them easier to remember. The problem here again is opportunity cost. Getting to the point where you can just write characters without thinking about them takes an extraordinary amount of practice. Having started learning Chinese as an adult myself, I can tell you that for most people this is prohibitively time-consuming. We're talking about many hundreds of hours, perhaps thousands of hours, and in that time you could have learned several other foreign languages or maybe advanced your Chinese in some other area in a significant way. So yes, if you think that handwriting makes it easier to remember the characters, do write by hand occasionally, but it's not worth the trouble to learn to write really well by hand for this reason alone. This means we've reached the final argument in this section, which is writing by hand makes it easier to distinguish similar characters when reading. Some people say that handwriting helps with reading because when you write, you need to pay attention to details, and sometimes when reading, these details matter. For example, we have the classic triplet of characters I, Ji, and Si, which are written identically except for the starting point of the third stroke. To make it easier to understand what characters I'm talking about here, we can say, for example, it's I Jing the I, so the I in the word I Jing already, and then if we extend this stroke upwards so it meets the starting point of the first stroke, it becomes Si. And if we don't let it protrude at all beyond the second stroke, it becomes Ji. The argument is then that if you write a lot by hand, and if you're required to write by hand, you will pay attention to these details, and then that these details matter when reading. I think this is very misleading. We don't read by decoding every individual stroke in every character we encounter. That will be terribly slow, and that's not how reading in any language works. If you write 自己 in the message, so self, but you use the wrong character for the second character, maybe you use the 一 in 已经, nobody will notice. And if against all odds they do notice, maybe they are a particularly picky Chinese teacher, they certainly won't misunderstand what you're trying to say. The reason is, of course, that 自己 is a very high-frequency word, whereas 自己, with the wrong second character, is not, and 自私, if you make another mistake, is not a word either, so people won't read these because they will see what they normally see. And remember, this is already a cherry-picked example, because most characters, of course, differ in much more than just the starting point of a specific stroke. For example, if you write the character 中, middle, and you start the third stroke a little bit too early or a little bit too late, it might make your handwriting a bit sloppy, but nobody will notice this if they read quickly, and they certainly won't misunderstand what you say. There are no other characters that are written like that. In fact, you can mangle characters quite a lot and change them much more than what we have talked about here, and people will still sometimes not notice, and they will still be able to read what you want to say. For more about this, I strongly suggest that you read an article by the Hexakoto called The Persistence of Comprehension, and as usual I'll put links in the show notes. So let's conclude section 2 by saying that the arguments here are often not wrong, except maybe the third one, but the problem is rather one of opportunity cost. It's not enough to say that handwriting has some specific benefit. It probably does have that benefit, it's just that you also have to take into account other things you couldn't do because you invested all that time into handwriting. And I'm not saying you have to use all the time you save to learn 3 other foreign languages. I'm saying you could still invest that time in learning more about characters, and that will give you all the benefits we've talked about and more. This means that we have now covered sections 1 and 2, and sections 3 and 4 will then be covered in an upcoming episode. Beyond the fact that the podcast episode would be really long if I covered all the arguments in one single episode, there is another benefit with splitting this into 2, and that is that you can have an opinion, you can share your experience with me, either regarding the sections and arguments I've talked about this time, or about those in sections 3 and 4, and I can then incorporate that into part 2. If you've listened this far, you already know what I think about the arguments in sections 1 and 2, but perhaps I might have missed something that belongs in these sections, or you might have opinions about sections 3 and 4, and to make that easier for you, I will here include the arguments that I plan to cover in an upcoming episode. So let me know what you think by sending an email to editor@hackingchinese.com or by leaving a comment on the website. Here are the arguments in section 3, cultural and personal arguments. Chinese characters are a core part of Chinese culture. You can't say that you've mastered Chinese if you can't write by hand. If you don't learn to write characters, you don't know what it's like. People don't study Chinese properly these days. We used to write by hand at school. Being able to write characters by hand is a great way to impress native speakers. Or not being able to write by hand can be very embarrassing. And here are the arguments in section 4, handwriting as a cognitive tool and emotional experience. Writing Chinese characters is good mental exercise, gymnastics for your brain. I like writing Chinese characters. It feels good and looks cool. Writing Chinese characters is meditative and relaxing. So let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.